trustee election. There's no budget vote this year, so registered voters who reside in the City of Batavia School District can vote for our library trustee candidate, who happens to be on our book sandwiched in committee. So Richard somehow got roped into running for the library board, so come out and vote for Richard if you want to. You can also write in.
Or write yourself.
You can write in a name, whatever you want to do. I don't think I'm supposed to tell you to vote for anybody, but whatever. So, all right. So without further ado, I'll let Richard introduce our speaker today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone that's I see a lot of familiar faces and a few new ones. That's great. My name is Richard Beatty. I've been on the committee forever, it seems like. Kathy is also, Kathy Yulee is here as one of our members. Today I'm very happy to introduce Ron Chrzanowski. Pretty close? Pretty close. I have coffee with Ron just about every day. And when a book's sandwiched in committee or whatever, I look for people. And Ron graciously accepted my offer to come and present a book. Ron, just so you know, he lives here in Batavia with his wife Ann for the past 40 years. He taught at Byron Bergen School District. Most of his career at Byron Bergen was spent teaching 10th grade global history and geography, along with 12th grade participation in government and various social studies electives. Something in the air. He has a BA in philosophy and his master's in education from Loyola University in Chicago. He is the vice president of the Jerome Foundation, president of Resurrection Parish Council, and after retiring from teaching, he has worked as the Parish Council outreach coordinator until 2019. He retired from that. His wife Ann is an aide at John Kennedy School. I get all kinds of good stories from Ron in the school. So. His son Dan is also a school teacher, and his daughter-in-law is a school teacher as well. Ron is an avid reader, and I can attest to that, and he walks his dog, Phoenix. One last really cool thing about Ron, he has visited most baseball stadiums in the United States. They tour together, a ragtag group. I believe you're the leader. You're the wise one. He's been to every stadium east of the Mississippi and a good number west. He's only missed Houston and San Francisco, maybe Seattle. No Seattle. All right. So without further ado, Ron is going to tell us about the book called The Escape Artist, The Man Who Broke Out of Auschwitz to War in the World by Jonathan Freedland. So take it away, Ron.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'd like to begin by calling your attention to yesterday, actually. If you were not aware, yesterday was Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. In the United States, it is commemorated from the Sunday before till the Sunday after, so it's during this week. And if you're interested, it'll probably be on some station. The official American commemoration is tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. at the U.S. Capitol. HaShoah, or Shoah rather, is the preferred term to what we in most English-speaking countries refer to as the Holocaust. Shoah in English translated means catastrophe. And in biblical terms, it connotes utter destruction. So you can see how appropriate that term is. A little bit about the author, Jonathan Freedland. He went to view the documentary Shoah when he was 19 years old, when it first came out. And he was very impressed with one of the interviewees who survived Auschwitz, named Rudolf Verba. And this is why he writes the book. I never forgot his name or his face, even though over the decades I would be struck by how few others had ever heard of him. And then some 30 years after that night in the cinema in 1986, I found myself returning to Rudolf Verba. We were living in the age of post-truth and fake news, when the truth itself was under assault. And I thought once more of the man who had been ready to risk everything so that the world might know of a terrible truth hidden under a mountain of lies. It was also the story of how history can change a life, even down the generations. How the difference between truth and lies can be the difference between life and death. And how people can refuse to believe in the possibility of their own imminent destruction, even, perhaps especially, when that destruction is certain. Those notions were stark and vivid in the Europe of the 1940s, but they seemed to have a new, fearful resonance in our own time. And quite often, if you do read the book, it did strike me how often there were parallels to his experience and the experience that we are going through today. So we begin. Rudy Verba was born Walter Rosenberg on September 11th, 1924. And he was born in Slovakia, which was then part of Czechoslovakia. But then came the Munich Agreement of 1938, and Slovakia was separated off as an independent state. And really, the author describes it as a creature of the Third Reich. The governing party was the Hlinka, which was ultra-nationalist, and the government really mirrored that of the Nazis. It was led by a priest named Father Joseph Tiso, and in his very first radio address, he said he had one firm policy: solve the Jewish question. So this issue of the Jewish question, the Jewish problem, was not simply German. It pervaded most of Europe. Father Tiso in 1947 was executed for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Walter at that time was 15 years old. He is no longer allowed to go to school. He is no longer even allowed to have books. But one of his friends somehow keeps hidden a chemistry book which they secretly go to and study. The Jews are banned from government jobs, from professions. They can't own cars, they can't own radios, they can't even own sports equipment. The program in Slovakia was called Aryanization, which is very ironic because the Nazis viewed all the Slovaks as Untermenschen, subhuman, inferior. They're not Aryan at all. 1941, they passed the Jewish Codex, which was equivalent to what was maybe commonly known as the Nuremberg laws, where the Jews are barred from everything. And the yellow star becomes something that they have to wear to identify them as Jews at all times. You may be familiar that that issue of the yellow star goes back to a medieval practice. A lot of the things that the Nazis did were not necessarily new. You could track them back to the Middle Ages. And often I've told students, the Nazis did not create anti-Semitism, they played to it because they knew how pervasive it was in most European countries. Well, in 1942, Rudy gets the letter to present himself with 25 kilograms of luggage and no gold for resettlement. And if this was aimed at all young, able-bodied men 16 to 30, and if they agreed to show up, to go quietly, The rest of their family will be able to stay and be not harassed. They'll just live happily, but you have to go. Rudy, his first reaction was, there's no way he's doing that. His plan was to escape to England. And he leaves Slovakia, and he makes his way into Hungary. But when he's in Hungary, he contacts Jewish committees there. They can't procure papers that he would need to be able to transit through Europe and to England. And they tell him, if you get caught here, it's going to be much worse. So you really need to go back to Slovakia, try and get such papers, and then attempt to escape from there. Well, on his way back to Slovakia, he's arrested by Hungarian authorities. They beat him up pretty well, and they dump him back across the border where he's apprehended by the Slovakian police. Now, the deal that was going on in Slovakia at the time is that for every Jew that would be deported, Slovakia would pay the German government 500 Reichsmarks. This was to cover food and shelter. And the deal would be that the Jews would never return, and that the government could confiscate the property and keep the proceeds. Walter ends up in Majdanek prison concentration camp in 1942. He's 17 years old. Along with Walter, there are about 13,000 Slovak Jews as slaves in Majdanek. After a number of weeks in Majdanek, one of the capos comes and announces that they're looking for 400 volunteers for farm work. And Rudy thinks that would be much better than the situation he's in. And so he volunteers, even though one of the fellow prisoners said, don't do it. You're going to end up in a worse place. Doesn't believe him. He volunteers, and at 9 p.m. on June 30th, 1942, 17 years old, Walter arrives at Auschwitz. And this is the description. Walter Rosenberg saw what looked to be high voltage wires, concluded that an electrified double fence enveloped the camp. He saw the watchtowers, on each of which was posted an SS man, his hands on a mounted machine gun. He saw the searchlight that constantly swept the camp after dark, and he saw the highly disciplined dogs that accompanied their SS masters. He looked closely at it all and wondered what secret was being guarded at this place that made it so imperative that no one ever be allowed to break out. Next morning at 5 a.m., he gets up for what was called appel at 6 a.m., which is the count. Prisoners were counted twice a day, beginning and end, including the dead. Whoever died in the barracks at night, the bodies were brought out to be counted. The living went on to work, the dead to the cremation. You can only imagine what's going through the mind of a 17-year-old teenager who sees this day after day after day. It is here that he is tattooed. He is then number 44070, and he is first sentenced to a labor detail at Buna, which was going to be an industrial complex to make synthetic rubber for the war effort under the authority of the German conglomerate IG Farben. Buna is that name for that artificial rubber. And so this is, he describes it as an incredibly hellish scene, but what makes it more hellish is while the work is going on and these prisoners are harried and beaten and shot, the engineers and architects are calmly walking around with their notebooks and measuring tapes, inspecting the building site. And he says they never see these prisoners. And it's a scene out of hell. They don't see it. typhus breaks out soon. And this scares the Nazis because obviously they're not immune. They could contract typhus as well as any of the prisoners. And there is no intention whatsoever to figure out a cure. The solution was simply that they would be killed. And so they refer to a weeding out process. They begin to look for symptoms of typhus in prisoners. And this is where Rudy learns one of the principles is to not show weakness, to look strong at all times. Even though you may feel very sick, don't ever show that, because you'll never survive this place. There is a weeding out in August of 42, of October of 42, of January of 43, and February of 43. Miraculously, Rudy makes it through all these screenings. From there, he is then sent to a section of the camp called Canada, but with a K. If you haven't read the book, I'll quickly explain where they get that name from. It's where they stored personal effects of all the people that came off the trains. And what Rudy notices is he sees these women who are emptying toothpaste tubes. They're squeezing out the toothpaste. And what they're looking for are diamonds, gems, coins, banknotes that people had hidden in the toothpaste. And the German phrase that was used, if I pronounce this correctly, kann da nicht was drin haben. Might there be something valuable inside? And that's where they got that term, Canada. There's food in the baggage, and sometimes it spills out, and at almost all the time, SS and capos are beating the prisoner, hurry up, quickly, and what they learn is when the capo or the SS is busy beating up some prisoner, you quickly scoop up that food, get it in your mouth before they ever see it. And so these prisoners look better fed, but that's why. They had access to food that others would not have had. Valuables were all collected, sorted, and anything that was not of value was simply burned so there'd be no trace of it. And so Rudy is noticing piles of clothes of older people, of older women, shoes, small shoes, toys. And it's starting to dawn on him that this place is not just a labor camp, but it's a factory of death. That he never sees these people. They disappear. And soon, he is working on these trains, and what he begins to do, he has a phenomenal memory. And he starts memorizing trains and dates and people and numbers, and he keeps storing them in his head. And one of the things that he describes, which is going to motivate him to escape, this is what Rudy's discovering. Slowly at first he realized that the Nazis were engaged in a great and devastating trick, that the crime unfolding before him rested on a single essential act that made the entire enterprise possible: deception. The Nazis lied to their victims at every step of their journey towards destruction, step after step after step. They would pretend that the dreadful journey the new arrivals had endured had been some kind of aberration, a mistake that was about to be rectified. Those transported were now in the hands of German officers who would naturally ensure that food and drink would be available, that their luggage would be looked after, and that order was about to be restored. Rudy witnesses one woman getting off the train and sees the Germans and says, "Thank God, it's Germans. They're civilized people." New arrivals climbed onto the trucks that would take them to the killing sites. SS men, their manners impeccable, might help the sick clamber aboard, offering a helping hand. For those heading to the death chambers on foot, there was more reassurance in the form of inquiries about the Jews' professional qualifications or trades back home. They intend to make use of the deportee skills. If anyone asked where they were being taken, the answer came back for disinfection. Once there, the deception did not let up. These were the Jews' final minutes, but the Nazis encouraged them to believe in a future they did not have. "What is your trade? A shoemaker?" the officer would ask again. "We need them urgently. Report to me immediately after." The SS would tell them they were about to bathe, that they should stay calm, and that afterwards they would be given coffee and something to eat. Signs on the doors read, "To the baths." The slaves of Canada were under the strictest orders not to breathe a word to anybody getting off the trains. They knew what was happening. One young man did say something to the prisoners, and the SS reassured her that no, that's not true at all. Nothing bad's going to happen. Once the deportees were gone, the SS officer came back, found the young man, took him behind the train and shot him. It did not take long for Rudy to realize what he had to do. If the Nazi plot to destroy the Jews relied on keeping the intended victims entirely ignorant of their fate to ensure they were lambs, not scattered deer, then the first step towards thwarting that murderous ambition was to shatter the ignorance, to inform the Jews of the capital sentence that the Nazis had passed on them. It was the only way to stop the killing. Somebody had to escape and sound the alarm, issuing the warning that Auschwitz meant death. Walter concluded that person should be him. He now understood the difference between knowledge and ignorance, between truth and lies, was the difference between life and death. It was clear to him from then on that the Jews destined for destruction could defy their fate here only if they knew of it incontrovertibly and before it was too late. Somehow Walter had to get out of this place and tell the world what was happening. And so he gets on to the escape plan. The way Auschwitz was set up, there were two rings. There was an outer ring and an inner ring. And during the day, when the workers were outside of the inner ring, the guards were at the outer ring. When they came out of the work site and back into the inner camp, then the guards were only at the inner ring. So if you could somehow be in that outer area when the guards were not at the outer gate, that was the possible escape route. And what out there in that area, it's a construction site. So there's all kinds of lumber and doors and debris, and they discover a crater. And their idea was that if you could get in that crater and get the boards and doors piled up on top, stay in there for 3 days. And the reason 3 days is if someone went missing, and again, they would know that immediately at the count, the alarm would go out, and the SS and the dogs and the capos would be out in the outer area for 3 days trying to find the escapee. So if you could stay in there, not get detected, after 3 days things go back to normal, and the guards are now only at the inner circle, not at the outer. And that's exactly what the plan was going to be. And Walter is going to do this with Fred Wessler, who was from his hometown, so they knew each other going back. April 7th, 1944, at 2 p.m. They go into the crater, 2 other inmates cover them up with boards and doors, and they don't know this, but that day was the night of the Seder and Passover, which was the Jewish celebration of movement from slavery to freedom. And on April 10th, they get through the 3 days. Things, again, go back to normal. They come out, and that's how they escaped. Now, can't go into a lot. They go through some harrowing details in the escape. They get out of Auschwitz. They find their way out. They have to make their way through Poland, which they do, and they get to Slovakia. And they report to the Jewish council there, and they begin to convey the information of what is going on in Auschwitz. And they testify for about 48 hours to the Jewish council authorities. They end up with a 32-page single-spaced report. Now, it has to be typed. There's no, you think, well, let's make copies. There's no copy machines yet. Okay, so every single copy would have to be retyped. And again, it's going to be in Slovak, and then to get it to it would have to be translated, typed again. So it was quite a process. One of the things that Rudy was concerned with, and Fred, is that they had observed people who were coming in on the trains. They were French, they were from Holland, they were from Belgium, they were from Poland, they were from Germany. They were coming from all over. And they realized that the Hungarians, there weren't Hungarians yet, and they were probably going to be the next and probably the last biggest Jewish community that was going to be exterminated at Auschwitz. And so they felt very important to get the word to the Hungarian Jews of don't get on that train. And Rudy's convinced that if they knew, they would create so much chaos that the Germans could never pull this off. It would be too chaotic. And that's the urgency they felt. The report says nothing about Hungary. And the Jewish council at that time says, well, we're going to report what did happen, what you did see, not what might happen. Maybe they won't transport the Hungarians, so they mentioned nothing. And Rudy is pretty upset at that. The German occupying army is sent to Hungary to begin the final solution of the Hungarian Jews. And they don't really need the Germans to do this because the government in Hungary was anti-Semitic from World War I on. They don't have to be encouraged at all. And Miklos Horthy, who is the head of the government, they figured, we can't notify the Hungarian government. They would be of no help whatsoever. So they turned to churchmen. They don't get a rounding response from any church leaders either, Catholic or Protestant. I think one Protestant bishop may have encouraged Horthy, maybe don't do any transportations, doesn't mention Jews though. But anyway, that doesn't get very far. It so happens that 2 other Jews escape from Auschwitz and get to Slovakia, and they reaffirm the testimony of Rudy and Fred. And they also mention that there's been an increase of trains with Hungarians, 14 to 15,000 a day, and only 10% of them are kept as prisoners. So 90% of them get off the trains right to the gas chambers. Now, Rudy's aim is to get somehow this message to the Hungarians, and he does get his report. It eventually gets out to the world press through a British journalist, but he's very interested in getting it to Hungary. And the report does get to Hungary, to the Jewish council there, who's led by a man, Rezo Katzner. who Rudy's going to grow to dislike immensely. Katzner, Rudy doesn't know this, but Katzner's in the midst of a negotiations. Eichmann is the SS in charge of the final solution in Hungary. And he's making a deal with Katzner. Money for lives. And he allows Katzner to get 1,700 Jews. And most of them were going to be from his hometown, his family, friends, influential people. And he paid $1,600,000 to Eichmann. This becomes known as the Katzner train. They would board these trains and be taken to Switzerland and on to safety and survive. One of the things that he had to agree to, he had the report. He had to keep the report quiet. He could not say anything to the general Jewish population, and the train would be allowed to leave. It became very controversial. There would be a trial eventually in Jerusalem over this, but I'll get to that in a bit. But anyway, that is what, while this is happening, he meets up with Gerda. I didn't mention her. It was like a childhood sweetheart back in his hometown that he knew. He meets up with her, and she does a lot of the typing for him of these reports. And eventually, the report gets to the Hungarian government officials. At the same time, the United States is finally sending out warnings to government leaders that whoever is involved in what's going on here with these deportations is going to someday face justice. This is 1944. I mean, the writing's on the wall. This war is coming to an end. What still is overwhelming is when the Germans are in the last throes of trying to win a war, they're more concentrated on trains to Auschwitz and to death camps. It makes no sense. But that's the reality. Anyway, with these warnings, the Hungarian government stops the trains. But by that point, somewhere like 300 or 400,000 Hungarians have already been sent to Auschwitz, and most of them were gassed. The last group were about 200,000 Jews in Budapest that were saved. For Rudy, this was not quite what he envisioned, but they were saved. As the war is coming to an end, the Germans come into Slovakia. Rudy joins the resistance. He's fighting against the Germans. And when the war is over, he's already given up his faith in God. When he was asked about faith in your fellow man and the goodness of, he would just smile and say, what are you talking about? Again, this is a teenager who went through this. But he maintained a strong belief in science, and he studies chemistry and technology at the Czech Technical University of Prague. He's a Communist Party member. And he marries Gerda, and that is never going to go well from day one. Rudy, because of his experience from Auschwitz and survival, is suspicious of everybody. He accuses her of all kinds of nonsense, and it just doesn't go well. And I don't know if it was her idea or both of them, maybe having children will change things. So they have two daughters. Helena is born in 52 and Zuzana in 54. And Rudy is going even worse. He is going completely off the rails. He's drinking heavily. He's having all kinds of affairs, including bringing them home. And basically, Gerda says, this is enough, and they divorce. Now, they're both in Czechoslovakia. They're both professionals, members of the Communist Party. but they want out. And so Rudy's on to another escape. She escapes to London. He escapes to Israel, which the law of return was any Jew coming back to Israel is welcome. So he ends up in Israel to start. The way they did that, though, is they were professionals and good standing members of the Communist Party, so they could travel. And they often would travel and come back, travel and come back, travel and come back. Well, they figured, well, this is the time we can travel and not come back. They're going to think we are. They don't. So that's how they both kind of escape. Rudy in Israel, he is really after what he considers those Jewish councils who were involved in the deportations. He just sees them as collaborators, especially that Katzner. And Katzner is actually put on trial in 1955 in Jerusalem, and he's found guilty of collaboration. He appeals the case. It's a big controversy of whether what he did was an attempt to save Jewish lives, or was he just saving his own skin and his friends. But anyway, he is found guilty. He appeals. 2 years later, the appeal process was still going on. He's going to his car one evening, and someone comes up to him and shoots him in the streets of Jerusalem and kills him. Probably, and there was no secret of what this person thought of his guilt or innocence. The court, the Supreme Court of Israel, reverses the conviction by 4-1. And they simply said, well, given the situation, you can't judge what he did. It's just too hard of a situation to be considered normal. Rudy's had enough of Israel. And he goes to London, where Gerda is living with another scientist and the two girls, and that doesn't go well. Gerda says, not only did she need the divorce, she needs custody of those girls, because Rudy's just not well. He can't get into the United States because he's a former Communist Party member. But he does end up in Canada. He's an associate professor on the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He's now 43 years old. And in 1972, he's officially a citizen of Canada. In 1973, he has a visiting lectureship at Harvard where he meets Robin. He's 50 and she's 24, but they hit it off. And he mellows. He's a really angry guy, but he mellows. And even Gerda says, yeah, he's really mellowed. He's not what he was. And they married in '75. He does not want to have children with Robin. And this is why. He said, I survived Auschwitz because I didn't have children. And when I have these two daughters, they've made me vulnerable and weak. And you can't survive if you're vulnerable and weak. And he didn't want children with her. Again, there are traits that he picks up in Auschwitz that never really leave him. In fact, when he was living with Gerda and the girls, she would go looking for something, an egg or whatever, and it would be missing. He was stealing it. He was stealing from his own house. It was just a habit he did. Anything he bought, he had pockets all over the place. Because anything that was worth anything, you keep on your person. Suspicious of everybody. Anyway, he appears on a TV series in Britain called The World at War. He appears in a show on the documentary. He's a pretty impressive character. The author thinks that he could have passed for Al Pacino on film. And he was just a striking person. His one principle in all these appearances was that if only the Jews knew what was about to happen, it would have been different, but they didn't know. We hear Auschwitz and we have all kinds of ideas coming into our mind. The Jews at that time, during the war, would hear Auschwitz, it wouldn't have any of those connotations. They were under the impression they were being resettled somewhere. He's unforgiving, he's angry, but he also is into enjoying life. He likes traveling, going to coffee shops. He loves French wine and scotch. And he has plenty. But he's enjoying himself. But what's about to happen to him next, he says, is the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life, as if it didn't happen already in the death camp. His oldest daughter became a doctor. She decided to go to Papua New Guinea to study malaria. He tells her, don't go. And the reason he tells her, he infuriates her, is you're too weak. You'll come back dead. She goes. She falls in love with a fellow doctor, but he's married. He goes back home, and she committed suicide. When Rudy found it, devastated him. Absolutely devastated him. For the next 8 years, he concentrates on studying about suicide, and he's wary of authority to start with. And one of the things that he gets into also is, did she really commit suicide? Are the governments and authorities trying to cover something up here? Maybe she didn't commit suicide. Maybe somebody committed a crime. But that's Rudy. Right? That's what helped him survive. And he goes on for 8 years, and Robin just doesn't know what to do. And one day, she says, they're walking, and out of the clear blue, he says, I'm done. And he quits. And it's like he got knocked down, and now he's back up and he wants to live, and he goes on with his life. And he's over it. In the 1980s and 90s, he gets, as I say, he's mellowing and he's more acceptable in the Jewish communities. They are inviting him to things because he's no longer this angry guy at the former Jewish councils, etc. And towards the end of his life, he's going to find out that one of the principles that he thought if people found out what was going on, it would stop. And he has this experience. There was a Georgie Klein who, back when Rudy first was giving his report during the war, he comes across Rudy's report, and he goes to his older uncle who's a rheumatologist, and he tells him what this report is about. He says, my uncle got red in the face, almost punched him out, and said, how can you believe such nonsense? And he said, every single older person that he knew that he went to reacted the same way. You're out of your mind. Why are you believing this nonsense of this report? And he's telling Rudy, look, from my experience, even if you got word out, people wouldn't have believed it. And then he gets into a realization, if I can find this. Led him to understand a more complicated truth, that information is necessary to be sure, but it is never sufficient. Information must also be believed, especially when it comes to mortal threats. Only when information is combined with belief does it become knowledge, and only knowledge leads to action. And again, it's the age-old story, how can you not believe? Well, you have to. If your stance is, I don't believe this, you don't believe it. And he comes to realize that maybe the mission he had of getting the information to the Jews, George Klein tells him, may not have happened. He also Rudy, when he was in the camps, thought that the Allies knew nothing of what was going on. And he comes to find out the Allies knew a lot more than they led on to about what was going on in Europe during the war years with the Jewish population. Rudy contracted cancer about 1995. Kept it to himself for the most part. Again, part of his death camp experience was don't show weakness, don't show vulnerability. After about 10 years, he finally went to doctors, had his bladder removed, but it had spread. And a year later, in 2006, March 27th, Rudy passed away. This is towards the end of the book. Rudy did not consider himself a hero. If a hero is defined by success in his chosen mission, perhaps Rudolf Verba saw himself instead in the tradition of the Jewish prophet, who comes to deliver a warning, only to grieve when that warning is not heeded. And though he never escaped Auschwitz's shadow, he lived a life in full as a man in full. He became a scientist and a scholar, a husband, a father, and a grandfather. He had helped the world and history know the truth of the Holocaust. And thanks to him, tens of thousands of others went on to live lives that were long and rich, as did their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So many, even he could not count them all. And that's the end of the story of Rudolf Verba. If you haven't read the book, highly recommend it. It's impactful, very impactful. There's a lot more in the book, obviously. When I was starting to get some of the things of what I would say, I said, I wish this was like a week-long seminar, because there's so much that you can get into with this. But
any
well,
questions?
Thanks.
You did a great job on that book because it was very intense and I had the same feeling at the very end that it says only when information is combined with belief does it become knowledge, and only knowledge leads to action. And then this French Jewish philosopher said, I knew about the Holocaust, but I didn't believe it. And because I didn't believe it, I didn't know.
And the denial continues.
Exactly.
And it amazes how people, but the denial is what people do. One of the things, there was a comment that one of the ways of dealing with something is to deny it. I'm not really sick. I don't believe that. One of them, I think it was a justice in the United States, was testifying to him, and he said, I heard it, I don't believe it. He's not lying. It's just that I can't accept it. No, you refuse this. But you're not lying. But I don't accept it.
Any questions or comments?
One more.
Oh, okay.
I do have a comment. Sure. I just recently read The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, and he was mentioned frequently, and Goethe also in that book.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of, I just finished that not too long ago, and this just kind of brought this whole picture together because they're both involved in that book as well.
Oh,
What's the name of the book?
The Dressmakers of
The Dressmakers.
Auschwitz.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
I guess my comment is, as society is today, and as media is today, we are full of whatever. And a lot of that whatever scares the bejesus out of me. Because I think we have a society now that if they like somebody, whatever that person says goes. And just that, I think we are in a very, I can't thinking, we're not an educated society anymore. Maybe I don't know, I'm frustrated. I guess I'm just frustrated with what's happening.
Well, there's so much misinformation.
Yeah.
And when someone will refer to, well, they lie, well, everybody lies.
Everybody has their own truth, I guess.